or I should say, the presidency of these United States, and he's running as a Republican for the nomination of the Republican Party. Sam, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
Well, Sam, before we get into discussion of the issues, I need to ask a couple of horse race questions, if you don't mind.
All right, let's get you up.
Okay, so why then the Republican Party? I mean, you have a former president of the United States and a ambassador to the UN. I've looked at your platform. On first glance, you don't strike me as necessarily a Republican sort of a candidate. In a way, it might be more appropriate as a Green candidate. So, why Republican? Why not run as a Green, or why not run as an independent?
So, wonderful questions. So, Green Party doesn't have any strength, power, or standing. In fact, the Green Party had approached me in the past to run for office, and they offered us everything from, oh, yeah, we'll get you people, we'll get you resources, we'll get you funding, and they never delivered. So,
I see.
the Green Party is effectively defunct in America. Why not as an independent? Well, being a regular citizen like you and me, we work for a living. We don't have millions of dollars or a last name like Bezos or Gates to get us the funding necessary to get on all of these things on our own, right? So we have to build our own merit. We have to build our own strength. And the Republican Party has been very good about allowing even dark horse candidates a chance. If they can get onto the stage through their own merits, and maybe we could even argue that I'm a little late to the game, right? But if I had, had the opportunity to get on the debate stage, I would have earned it and they would have respected it. And so to me, the Republican Party is the only fair party currently in existence. But why run for Republican at all when my platform is what it is? Well, I'd like to say that I am a Republican, a traditional Republican, an Eisenhower Republican. And I won't go too far into detail, but for instance, I'm assuming one of the things that definitely stood out was the high tax rate for wealthy individuals. During the Eisenhower administration, who was a five-star general during World War II, one of the most prolific Republican presidents in our nation's history, his tax rate of the top percent was 94. And so and his reasoning for it is the same reason I have for it, is rather than hoard money as an individual, you can reinvest in the company, the resources, the community, your employees, what have you. It's not meant to take the money and give it to the government, right? It's meant to encourage investment, reinvestment, rather than just focusing on shareholders and outsourcing. Neither here nor there. I hope that answered the question.
No, I mean, I've heard that about Eisenhower, and I'm not sure that that kind of a tax increase is going to be effective, because in this economy where you have multinational and global companies, they're not going to pay that tax. They'll just shift it over to the Cayman Islands, and the people that are going to get stuck, holding the bag are going to be middle class people and lower middle class people. That seems to be what happens. But maybe you might have a program that could address that. But putting that, I want to ask you about some other issues you take. You talk about police reform, and your position on that strikes me as somewhat of a nationalization of policing. Is that the case? And what is your vision with regard to policing?
So that is in fact the case. And I say nationalization of our police forces, and because of my bias from having served in the military, if your security forces or if your military police, whether you're in the Navy, the Marines, the Army, or I'm sorry, the Air Force, Coast Guard, what have you, right? Any of the branches, it's the same, right? You have the same job description, you have the same requirements, you have the same, rules of engagement, if you will. It's across the branches. It's the DoD. Whereas some small community in BFE, Idaho or Ohio is going to have their local police department, their sheriff's department, and the Highway State Patrol, which acts all three individually different. And it's different whether you go to the next city over, the next county over, the next state over. So if we could federalize the requirements and the standardization of what is and isn't a lawful order, for instance, or what the minimum requirements are to become a police officer, the minimum training requirements. In many states, it takes more training to become a barber than it does to become a police officer. There's some common sense reasons for the nationalization, and it's also to help mitigate the ire against law enforcement, right? Because a lot of people are against law enforcement, a lot of people are pro law enforcement, but there isn't a real good consensus of how to bridge that divide. And I think by creating a standard where there is a good understanding of what is and isn't acceptable for law enforcement, how they act, how they conduct themselves, what their training programs are. You know, if you get a speeding ticket, well, I want to know why I got a speeding ticket and what constitutes all that fun stuff. If we nationalize it, there is no longer any questions, and it will allow us to dedicate those resources accordingly, right? There'll be a stratification instead of, everybody, complaining about Highway State Patrol camping on the highways during rush hour. We'll be able to say, no, Highway State Patrol is not camping to pull you over. They're trying to make sure that there isn't any drug or human trafficking on I-75 or on Route 66 or what have you. That's the intent.
Okay. All right. So then your position on national policing is not literally to have a national police force. It's more just have national standards to regulate local policing. Is that right?
Right. Something where the policing itself has a standard regulation, maybe even a fitness test or something, but whatever that may look like, not to create an American Gestapo.
Well, yeah, that's what I was getting at, because I mean that's a hallmark of an authoritarian regime.
Exactly.
To have a national, and the American tradition's always been that policing is local, and that the highest law enforcement officer in the land is the county sheriff, where the regulation takes place. So that's an interesting position. Now, your issue on the border crisis, you seem to be somewhat conservative on this. What is your vision with regard to the present condition, which is essentially opening the border and allowing up to 1 million illegal aliens to just simply cross into the country and get a free cell phone and a check, and they're told to come and appear a year from now, and then they just disappear into the firmament, including over 100,000 unaccompanied children. What's your position on that?
Right. So what you just described is unacceptable. I don't care how left-leaning you are. I mean, there's a difference between addressing a humanitarian crisis, which is the approach I take, and addressing an illegal immigrant border crisis, which is the way the previous administration took it. I think there's a way to address the humanitarian crisis while ensuring that whatever they are doing can be tracked, can be monitored, and can be reciprocated, right? You don't get to just come into our country, take our stuff, and go home, right? If you want to come into our country, there has to be a process. Now, many argue that it is too expensive, it's too time-consuming, it's too yada, yada, yada to get a visa, a green card, or even permanent citizenship. So as far as I'm concerned, the money aspect shouldn't matter. It's, can you be a productive member of society? Will you pay your taxes? Will you contribute? Will you be law-abiding? Will you be supportive of your community? Will you adapt to your community, right? And will you abide by our nation's laws, right? And as long as those things can be met, I don't see why we can't create, say, a work to citizenship program. We already had this for the military. You enlist for 4 years, and then after your 4-year enlistment, or I think if you deploy sooner than that and get medically discharged, you would get your citizenship. You earned it. You literally fought for it. So I think we should create some sort of program in which, and I address this, of course, I believe we should have a work to citizenship program where you are, and this is where the terminology gets a little, but you'll have paperwork, you'll have designations, and you'll have work skills assessment. So say you're just from, I don't know, somewhere in South America, and your only skill is labor. Okay, fine, that's your only skill. That's unfortunate, but we need labor and we need that skill here. So this is where you go. You don't get to ask questions. You don't get to complain. You get to go here. Now, if you're an engineer from, say, Argentina, okay, hey, you have a few options. You can go here, here, or here, but this is your work program to become a citizen. You don't get to do whatever you want. You got to, I don't know, talk to Border Patrol or something each month. I believe I go into further detail saying that, there's like reports and so on and so forth that you have to file as that immigrant. But I think if we address it that way, we ensure that we are bringing immigrants into our country and putting them in the right places that can actually thrive for America, but also thrive individually so that crime doesn't proliferate. Because right now, it's the okay corral. So yeah, you are going to have criminals. You are going to have people who are desperate, who would otherwise be law-abiding citizens because they don't have some sort of legal protection or what have you. So yeah, you have to be some sort of status so that you can be protected, but so that you can also do your part. I hope that makes
So
sense.
no, I mean, but I guess that the underlying question on that is, first of all, it seems like you want to legalize immigration and make legal immigration more prevalent, which I think is a good position. However, the numbers of immigrants, what is your position on that? Because it seems to me that that ought to correlate with the ability of the economy to absorb immigrants, as opposed to Americans getting jobs first in an economy that's somewhat stagnant right now. So, what would you predicate the number of immigrants on?
So that is a great question. It's the way I address it is several fold. So I have the America Works program, which encourages jobs to be brought back, but then also initiates like a national works program, in the sense that the federal government would then pour in resources to get a high-speed rail system, and then the necessary infrastructure to facilitate it. Right, it would generate tens of millions of jobs, just like when Eisenhower initiated the highway uh,
Yes.
construction program, right? So that's one of the ways you address the stagnant jobs market for not just Americans, but to also help buffer some of that immigration influx as well. Currently, of course, you would have to limit it. 100,000, 1%, 10%, 20%, whatever the numbers actually amount to, or you would have to do the travel thing. It's like, all right, hey, in lieu of paying for the visa thing, you're gonna have to pay for your trip out to, say, Ohio from Texas, but then we'll make sure that you have job placement, and we have this federal facility, what have you, for your first month until you get your first month's check, and then you're expected to pay rent or something, right?
Hmm.
There's a myriad of different ways to handle that transition, but the numbers as they currently are, like you said, is stagnant. And granted, we can argue about what are the jobs that are being taken. Are they jobs that Americans even want? Like, who wants to work in the fields, right? Most of those jobs do go to immigrants, illegal or otherwise. But these high-paying jobs, like in tech or in medicine or whatever, those aren't just going to immigrants. Those are going to the most qualified individual. So if we create more jobs and encourage jobs to be brought back to America, fine. Yeah, I said I wanted to do Eisenhower taxation. So rather than the CEO and the shareholders taking billions of dollars outright and putting them to Cayman Islands like we discussed, instead now that's like, well, crap, there's no benefit to doing that. So let's bring these jobs back, expand our operations, hire more people, get them trained, and get them whatever. And with the American Works program, there's the additional tax incentive, the additional money is available to encourage and facilitate that aspect. So it's more than just the immigration policy. It's also addressing the jobs issue, like you also brought up. By merging these two policies together, you can address both, because at the end of the day, we are a nation of immigrants. We're the melting pot nation. And I think
Right.
we are strongest when we embrace that.
And you seem to embrace somewhat of a nationalist position in the American tradition, going back to Henry Clay and Alexander Hamilton and Franklin D. Roosevelt also. This idea of massive national infrastructure projects. One that I heard that's quite interesting is to divert the Great Slave Lake in Canada and the massive river, which dumps trillions of gallons of fresh water every week into the Arctic Circle, and to bring that by pipeline into the western part of the United States, which is experiencing a drought, and other innovative ideas that used to be the American hallmark. We had building the Erie Canal in its day was very progressive. It was something that hadn't been done at that level. So, that to me sounds good. I mean, that's classic Republican thinking going way back to the 19th century. And I know that Trump's tried to do some of that, but I don't know how effectively. But you really seem to take that on directly, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Now, yeah,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
Sorry.
As
I
far
was
as your, no, please go ahead, Sam.
I'll say that is the intent. What we have why I think we have stagnated is we've had nearly centuries of war, right? I mean, as effectively, we've had maybe 5 or 6 years, maybe a decade of peace in this country. It's always been one conflict after another: Vietnam, then the Cold War, then the Middle Eastern wars, Desert Shield and Storm, and then the global war on terror, which was the one I participated in, right? but we've never had something to build. The last thing that we came together as a country to do was landing on the moon. And I just feel like it is time for some other American great work. So I apologize. I just wanted to get that out.
No, no, that goes to my next question and my next issue, which is foreign policy. You're a military man. You've been overseas. Um, President Trump stood for non-intervention, not nation building. Ending this policy that we've had going all the way back to the Wilson administration, which is a perpetual war for perpetual peace, as described by historian Charles Austin Beard, and basically to put American interests first and to de-escalate, to get the NATO to pay its own way, to support our allies, but not constantly be involved in these interventions. So I guess that your policy, what would that be with regard to America's stance vis-a-vis our allies in the world?
So, in this regard, I think me and Trump actually do align quite well. I do believe in a peaceful approach. For one, we have the strongest military in the world. There is no question about that. I mean, yeah, China and Russia, they like to shake their fists, but realistically, nobody wants to fight America. That is the truth. So we've established this. We also have the strongest economy in the world. The only two countries, or the only two economies that come close, is the Chinese economy, which has spent the past 30 years developing, and the entirety of the European Union, which is what, over 30 countries at this point? So it takes 30 countries and China being left alone for 30 years to even compete. And they have a population that dwarfs ours by a factor of 4. So why aren't we using our economy? Why aren't we using our diplomacy? Why aren't we using anything else to address these concerns? I mean, we've seen in the past that by simply changing or protecting trade routes, you can devastate a national economy, right? So I do agree. We should be less fighting. We should be less war. We should be less all this, that, and the other. Sure, support our allies, absolutely. But, accountability where accountability is due. And in my military policy, I also added a little bit of tongue-in-cheek is if our Congress, which is the ones who get to decide whether or not we go to war, wants us to go to war, if they're that bloodthirsty, then they should participate in the war. And I mean that truthfully. I mean, I get that in terms of a sovereign state and the stability of a nation, putting your entire Congress on the front lines with a flak jacket and a rifle is the dumbest thing you could possibly do. It puts a giant target on their heads. But what you can do is you can make them go to the triage locations. You can make them see the horrors of war. You can make them experience it for a few days, for a week, or what have you, and then make them understand that their actions have consequences. That war is not this thing, this ephemeral thing that happens on a screen or on the news. This is real people, our children, our sons and daughters, laying down their lives, taking somebody else's sons and daughters for your whatever view or vision. And now don't get me wrong, there are reasons to go to war. World War II, stopping Hitler, right? I'll grant you that. The Korean War was another necessary war. Vietnam, we can debate about that. The global war on terror. We definitely needed to go after Saddam, but after that, that's where the debates come into play. So sure, when it is necessary, fine. We will go to war. I am happy to support it. But when it's not, when it's just profiteering and proliferating instability, or like you were saying, nation building, that becomes a problem, and accountability needs to be had.
All right. And what is your position with regard to support for the state of Israel?
So I know that's a very contentious subject, and I would like to defer to this point. I think what's happening in Israel and in Palestine is something that is going to continue and has been going on for the past 2,000 years. They need to find a way to resolve this in a peaceful manner. I would prefer a ceasefire solution in which the resolution of peace is in some way that allows Palestine and Israel to exist on the map together. Beyond that, I really don't want to get into it.
Oh, okay. I mean, there's certainly in Boston, there's a lot of money being spent by, I don't know, this Muslim council with gigantic billboards saying ceasefire now. And I would think that's supportable if it's a mutual ceasefire. That would mean that the Hamas would have to stop firing missiles into Israel. So I don't. It seems very, based on a track record, unlikely unless Israel completely removes their missiles. Um, I want to talk a little bit about some of the social issues that always come up
Of
in
course.
a campaign. You know, as president, you have to sort of represent certain of these issues.
Hmm.
I noticed that Joe Biden is campaigning with gigantic billboards behind him saying, "Bring back Roe," which of course is a reference to Roe versus Wade. I
Hmm.
don't quite know how that can happen because the Supreme Court is a separate and independent entity, and they've
Hmm.
already made that decision whether we like it or not.
Hmm.
So I guess that in this regard, what is your position on abortion as it would affect the national government? Because right now it's more of a state issue. And
Hmm.
also, where are you with gay rights and
Hmm.
other women's rights?
So excellent. I would say, to put it simply, if we are the melting pot nation of the world, if we are a nation of many and of diversity and this, that, and the other, then we have to embrace that diversity. And when we talk about freedom and rights, that isn't a slice of pie that once you divvy out all of the rights and the freedoms to the various demographics, you're out of pie. Freedom and rights is universal. So LGBT rights to me is in the name. They have rights. They have the same exact rights as you and me.
Of course.
Same thing with transgender people. They have the same rights as you and me. And the same thing with the women's right to choose. There's body autonomy, right? If we cannot have agency over our own bodies, then what do we actually have agency over? And a lot of the argument, and I know that there are some doctors in some fields that argue that life begins at conception, and then that there's others that say, well, technically the fetus isn't even viable outside of the womb, and then you have the religious people who say, well, life begins at first breath, and then you have the other religious people that say life begins at conception. When you get into all of that, fundamentally, then it becomes a question of what does the individual believe, right? If we can't hammer down a true moral imperative, the scientific community is divided and the religious community is divided, then the only option then becomes is the individual moral obligation. Do you as an individual wish to have or have the moral, I guess, standing to have an abortion? Yes or no? And then is there viable medical procedures available to do so, right? We're not talking about, you have to mandate plastic surgery or you have to mandate, I don't know, getting a third limb or something, right? We're talking about, life preserving. We're talking about, because the other part with abortion isn't used as birth control. I mean, there's things like ectopic pregnancies. There's extra utero, right? Like there's things that I've never even heard of, right? That or just straight up miscarriages.
But no, there's medical reasons
Right.
for abortion, and I think that the states that regulate abortion allow for that. The problem is that they need to iron out the possibility that if there's a medical reason for an abortion, then a woman should get an abortion, and that there are doctors who are afraid to do an abortion because the state has like the heartbeat rule and the and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But as a matter of public policy, I mean, yes, sure, personal choice. The right now, the way it stands is that it is regulated by the states, and that the
Mhm.
people. It's very democratic in a way. Look, I mean, people elect representatives in their state to
Mhm.
regulate abortion, and I think that you seem to want to either have it be an individual choice, which removes government altogether, or do you want to have a national solution?
So I let me clarify, because I was going into the weeds a bit, and I apologize for that.
It's okay.
The national solution to this problem, so the federal standard, my view is that it is. So the federal mandate is that it is an individual choice, and that the medical professionals have to honor it. Because again, if we're talking about all religions being equal and fair, and if we're talking about there isn't an actual scientific and moral imperative, right? We're not talking about the baby comes out fully formed and then is scissored to death, right? We're not talking about that. That's murder, right? Like
Right.
we're very clearly there's these fine lines that needed to be hammered out. But in general, right, we need to understand that this isn't something that somebody else can say on behalf of another, right? It would be like saying men need to get vasectomies at age 18. How is that okay, right? It's the same core principle, except women don't have the choice right now in every state. And I think that's the case. I think if we're going to be a nation of freedom and we're going to call ourselves the freest, fairest nation on earth, then the least we can do is give women that choice. And there will be plenty of women who don't get abortions. And there'll be plenty of women that judge other women who do, and vice versa. That's the social argument. That's fine. But legally speaking, and it's just like with LGBT rights, if we can get married, and marriage is just a contract to deal with tax issues and being able to deal with medical issues in terms of death or in a coma or things like that, if that's the contract of marriage, right? Yes, there's religious connotations to it. Then so too must be the body autonomy. We may disagree on this, and I know there's plenty in the Republican Party that would, but I just firmly believe that if we are not a nation of freedom, if we can't even be in control of our own bodies, we can't even, and I'll use this harsh terminology, we can't even harvest the organs of the deceased to give to people who need them without the consent of the deceased. Does that make sense? If we can't even do that, then how can we tell someone who's alive what they can and can't do with their body, and then be as strict or punish them for something that happens naturally? Like, again, the fact that miscarriages fall under this abortion ban with the heartbeat bills, you're going to commit, or you're going to charge this woman with murder for having a miscarriage. That is a natural phenomenon, right? So rather than go down that rabbit hole, let's make it her choice and allow the procedures to exist, and then discuss the nitty gritty individual opportunity, situations where it's like, that's too questionable to be considered. That where do we then do the line of murder? Clearly somewhere along the lines of the third trimester. So I hope that clarifies that.
Well, let me just, I just want to bear down a little bit more here, because you're being very political, which is fine. You are a politician. You are then calling for national policy to regulate abortion, because right now, after Roe versus Wade, it's been seen as not constitutional for the federal government, other than, as you say, cases of outright murder, which, by the way, some of the radical pro-choice people support. But yet you want to have the nation, the president, the Congress, the U.S. Supreme Court, all of our infrastructure to regulate abortion nationally and to remove that prerogative from the states, which of course would be, I suppose, another form of Roe versus Wade, except rather than have that be done by judiciary, you would have it be done by the president and by Congress. Is that right?
Yes, and it goes into other arguments too, right? Like, what is the role of federal government? When does it encroach upon state government? Because there are clear divides in the Constitution, right? So currently, states have the right to mandate their own budget and their own curriculum for education. But if they don't adhere to federal standards and federal minimums, they don't get federal money, right? The way I would approach this, and to hopefully clarify even further without being political, it would be a similar thing. You can choose to disallow abortions, but then you don't get nearly as much Medicare funding. You can choose to create extremely strict abortion regulations, but then you don't get this pot of Medicare money, right? If you do allow up to X, Y, and Z, then you do. What I'm saying is there needs to be a minimum standard, right? And there needs to be a minimum common sense standard in terms of law of what is and isn't considered abortion. And again, miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, things that would endanger the mother or the child or both. These are things that must be allowed and must be.
And I think they are allowed by all states, except the problem is, as I mentioned, that some doctors are concerned that they might be charged with doing an elective abortion if they do one which there is a legitimate reason, which is very rare, but it does happen. Sam Roden is my guest. He's running for the presidency of these United States as a Republican. You talk about LGBTQ. What's your stand on the transgender surgeries for children?
So that is a very contentious one. Personally, so Samuel Ronan, I think children getting gender reassignment surgery is a bit much. I think when you're young, you're still developing, you're still making decisions about your life and the way that you feel, and the way that you are, and you're discovering your own identity, right?
Hmm.
Personally, Samuel Ronan, I do believe gender reassignment surgery before the age of 18 is problematic. I wouldn't I wouldn't encourage my child, if I had one, to do so.
Hmm.
In terms of getting gender reassignment surgery and having it covered under, Medicare and all this other stuff and protected in medical insurance, I do in fact agree with that. If you're an adult and you are transgender and you feel male to female, female to male, that's your prerogative. It is a quality of life improvement. Studies have shown that less than 1% of those people who get those surgeries regret it. So it's a general improvement to the individual, much like, if you have you get a skin graft because of a really horrific burn or something like that, right? I can I can support that. When it comes to children, I think therapy would be better. Like being able to discuss it, to truly embrace it. I think social stigma is really the bigger issue here. I think if we as a country accept diversity, which, this is going a little bit off kilter from the politics, historically, and I'm talking for the past 15, 20,000 years of human society and civilization, there have been historical records of transgender, two-spirit, however have you, in indigenous cultures, Greek and Roman cultures, Asian cultures, all across the globe, here in North America as well. And homosexuality having been around for just as long, right? Cesare Borgia, his boyfriend, was the one who commissioned all of the portraits that are now become the face of the church in Jesus Christ, right? So it's not like this is new, it's just socially unacceptable. So if we can get past that, I think a lot of the LGBTQ and transgender issue stereotypes and concerns go away. I think that's the growing pains we're heading towards. I think we're getting more and more accepting and tolerant and just like with desegregation, that was a growing pain, and we saw that with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X being assassinated, and then 20 or 30 years later, okay, cool, racial integration, we're happy now, right? So
Right.
I think that's the bigger core issue, but you're right, and I will concede the point that gender reassignment surgery for children is perhaps a step too far. There could potentially be reasons for it. I can't imagine what they might be. I know hermaphroditism is a medical phenomenon that does happen in 10 million, 1 million people, and then extra chromosomes, of course, in 1 in 10,000. I know there are these anomalies, and maybe you do need to get gender reassignment surgery to fix yourself in those
Right.
circumstances.
Hmm.
We should allow that, but to
Well,
say,
that's always been done with
yeah,
infants. I mean, but really the it seems like the social line is drawn with regard to protecting children and the
yeah,
innocence of children, and that includes not just castrations and hysterectomies for children, which is going on right now,
yeah,
right here in my own hometown of Boston,
yeah,
but also gay porn in school libraries and schools, and kind of other sort of propaganda. I mean, we want to protect our children from all of it because they're not old enough or they don't have enough wisdom or reason
hmm,
to understand these issues. I mean, we've always protected them from all sexual matters. And that seems to be a major issue on the national stage culturally. I don't know so much if it's a presidential issue; it's more of a state issue. But would you have some sort of a coherent national policy? Because you mentioned that you could use federal agencies to coerce states to legalize abortion by
hmm.
withholding funds. Would you have a national policy with regard to these issues that I just brought up?
Sure. And to be fair, they already are. I mean, the education funding, mandates X, Y, and Z, and then of course reproductive education starts in like what, the sixth grade or what have you. And I mean,
Yeah, but I'm talking about these issues specifically.
No.
Like,
I know what you mean. Like, so there's the transgender issues and queer and all this, that, and the other being taught in schools, and
exactly.
then some curriculums at the local, state, or what have you level taking it a step too far. Yes, we can absolutely regulate that. There is a fine line between discussing. There are people who are queer and there are people who are trans,
But we don't need to know all the details.
right. We don't need to go into any sort of carnal any of that.
Exactly.
No,
Well,
no.
that's it. I mean, it seems like it kind of border. I know that it's a word that's controversial, but it does get into a question of grooming, quite frankly. And
True.
we need to take positions, I think, nationally on that. I mean, just in any sense, protecting children from all of it because they're not old enough to a child physically, emotionally, mentally, they're children. They're not
They're
old enough
children.
to
Yeah.
understand these issues, right?
No, and it goes back to like the Epstein list. I mean, how is it that so many world leaders, so many, public figures were on this flight log with this person publicly, and none of that's being addressed, right? No, you're 100% correct. We do
Mm.
need to take care of our children. If we aren't fighting for anything other than our children, what are we fighting for? Like, we can argue till the crows come home about every individual issue, but if we aren't providing a nation and a structure and a society for our children to inherit, then we're kind of wasting our time. So I agree. And your argument about that it could be considered grooming, going too far into the rabbit hole about carnal activities. Yes, 100% agree. That shouldn't be taught in any sort of grade school. That shouldn't be taught till maybe even college, and only then if it's relevant, right? There's things that should not be taught to children, and there are things that can possibly be taught to adults so long as there's some actual general relevance to it. But then we start getting into other things too, like accessibility to pornography, accessibility to all these other things, and then addressing predatory behavior, right? How many times do we see teachers ending up dating their students or worse, from whatever age group, right? Whether it's from elementary school all the way through high school. How can we create a scanning system to prevent those individuals becoming teachers in the first place and getting hired in the first place, right? We definitely need to add that. And that would be among the many things that I would add to the federal education program and plan that must be adhered to as a minimum standard. We need better enforcement. We need better accountability. And you're right. If there is any of that going on, then we do need to remove it from the hands and eyes and ears of children, because we cannot do that. Can we approach sexuality like discussing the LGBT spectrum? Sure, we can do that. Discuss it. We're not going to go into the weeds about how it looks and how it operates. We need to be accepting and accommodating. Just like if we have a philosophy class, we should be teaching various religions and various philosophies in that class, but we shouldn't be taking it to that next level and creating cults in schools.
Right, right. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing a little bit more civics in class where you get young people can get a copy of the U.S. Constitution and understand it. And I thought there was an interesting proposal by Congressman Shadegg of Arizona years ago to basically put all legislation online and have none of it exceed more than 3 pages so that it can be viewed and debated in civics classes by high schools. And we can actually get to understand how our government works, not to mention get rid of some of this graft and loopholes that are enriching, various special interests. So Sam Ronan is my guest. He is running for the presidency. Sam, as we sort of move toward wrapping it up, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your ground game.
Mhm.
How are you expecting to compete in the primaries? How are you getting out your vote? What is your street team like? What happens after the primaries if you don't succeed? Are you going to be going forward into the general election?
Thank you. So the team is focusing mostly on online interactions, phone banking, text banking, email banking, and social media growth. Having boots on the ground personnel, you know, swag gear, and yard signs is a huge capital investment. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're just regular workers here. We're just a regular person. The main
Gotcha.
premise of my campaign, of course, I do want to win, don't get me wrong, but it's also highlight that a regular person can run, right? That our democracy is available to all and not just the elite. So by building our message, building our platform, being able to speak with people like you, it does prove that point. And so we're building our message, we're resonating that way. Now, once the dust settles in the primaries, no, I will not be going into the general election as an independent. Again, the financial resources necessary to accomplish that are significantly beyond my means. And honestly, it would, given the current dynamic, it's going to be a Trump-Biden combating, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I would like to do, though, is work with whoever the winner is and continue to bolster the democratic process, get out the vote, encourage people to participate and show, again, that by participating, you can make a difference, right? I'm not saying if I was on the Trump administration, I could change his mind on things, but I could influence my area of my responsibility. And I think that's what we should strive for. So
would you be endorsing the nominee for the Republican Party?
I think at this point, yes, I would. I would endorse them. I would support them. I might have a little asterisk that says I don't necessarily agree with everything they're doing, but sure, they're the nominee, and I'd like to do my part to get this country back on its feet.
No, look, I think what you're doing is very interesting, and that's why I've had you on. I like the idea of the citizen candidate stepping up and running for office. I did it myself in Massachusetts when I ran for Congress, and it's a very interesting experience because whether you win or not, you do get to knock a couple of issues over the plate, and you do raise the awareness of these issues in the mind of the public, which can very much change our culture and the course of the nation. So I applaud you for doing what you're doing, Sam. I hope other people consider doing it. Let my viewers and listeners know how they can reach you and how they can contribute or help.
Awesome. So if you're wanting to help, the easiest way is to sign up on the website, samronan.com. And if you want to reach out to me, most of my social media is Sam4President 2024. So just search for those. You'll find me. We're open to all support and all help, phone banking, text banking. We even have flyers for you to knock on doors with.
Excellent. Sam, listen, thanks so much for joining me. Let's stay in touch and keep me posted as things develop.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and I look forward